Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be with you today. Today we are doing once again a responding to the critics of the Spalding-Rigdon theory of the Book of Mormon and origin. And what I want to do is to take a look at the responses to this theory, because the judging the merits of a theory is based on how much does it really hold up. And so that's why I want to do these series of lessons. So one of the things that Mr. Barton says, he says, in this video you did mention questionable activities by the Smith family. Yet you don't mention that no first-hand accounts can support any of these alleged activities. I should also have mentioned that the claim was made that Joseph Smith Jr. wrote the Book of Mormon for money when they were given away free, and often caused debt in order to print them. That's a major oversight unless you cover it in another video. And, I want to be generous to people. And I myself am always learning new things. And so I want to be kind about this, as a Christian should. And one of the things that we need to recognize is that D.P. Holbert, he obtained the affidavits of the Smith family when he traveled to New York in the winter of 1833, and then he would eventually give those to E.D. Howe, probably in 1834, probably in the, I don't know exactly when that would have been, though. But my focus would have been on the series of 35 lessons, was focusing more on the authorship of the Book of Mormon rather than getting into the character of Joseph Smith. Although the fourth test in that eyewitness reliability, which is bias, that would have something to do with whether he would pass that test, and I don't think he would do so, because with what we talked about is the love of money. Talked about gaining power and sexual lusts, in which, if you look at history, I mean, we see it Joseph Smith in regards to polygamy, introducing polygamy again, in regards to gaining power among his followers, and also getting rich. I mean, so this is something for people to think about. So, and then with regards to what Barton says here, that Joseph Smith giving away the Book of Mormons for free, I would just like him to see that even Hardy, who wrote the Reader's Guide to the Book of Mormon, he actually writes this. He says, this is July of 1829, Egbert B. Grandin, a printer in Palmyra, reluctantly contracts to print 5,000 copies of the book for the sum of $3,000. He had at first refused a job, but when Joseph found a willing printer in Rochester, Grandin reconsidered, seeing that the book would be published one way or another. Martin Harris promises to mortgage his farm to come up with the money. And then if you look down there at March 26th, 1830, the Book of might have to show this. Let me see if I have to show this to everybody. Oh, okay. People can see it. The Book of Mormon is available for purchase, and copies sell for $1.25. Now, interesting also, on page 13 of the Spalding Story Reexamined, which is by Joseph Smith III, and you'll see that on page 13, there at the bottom, the Book of Mormon was sold at the start at $1.25. So just showing you that it was sold. But, I mean, could books have been given away for free? I don't know the answer to that. But I do know they were sold to people for $1.25. In fact, if you go to the Missionary Journal of Orson Hyde, he actually says here, as you can see, February 13th, 1832. And I'm just going to show you here what I'm talking about. And he says, this is in regards to, Conneaut, going to Conneaut. which was also called Salem. And then he says he sold 2 books of Mormon there. Okay, and that's 2 years later. Okay, that should tell you something. Then, even March 2nd, 1832, went on to Mill Creek and found where Calvin sold a book for $1.87.5. So, now whether that is the Book of Mormon, it's, to be debated. Anyways, I hope that what we can see here is, in regards to this, that sometimes the Book of Mormon was not given away for free, but it might have been. And I like to get, if somebody would like to give me some more historical documentation on that, I would be glad to look at that. So, just wanted to say about that. Okay, let's look at Kristen. He says, just as a school of thought, if someone had a vision of future events, could they not draw upon words, phrases, or occurrences from said future events? Also, the issue is man. For example, the Ethiopian Bible is different from the Orthodox 1611 King James Version, which is a translation of a translation in of itself. Also, difference in LDS from Muslim. The angel Moroni testified of Christ, led to a book revolving around Christ and his infinite atonement. I must you take a deeper spiritual direction rather than one of earthly traditions. Think about it. If a book is true, it is a big deal. Just some thoughts from an upstream thinker. Well, it's true. Let me say at the first, I have read the Quran, and the Quran does talk about in Surah 4 that Christ did not die on the cross. So that's pretty clear that that's a major contradiction between the Bible and the book and the Quran, in that Jesus did not die on the cross. But what Muslims do believe, that Jesus is actually the Messiah. They do believe him to be the anointed one. I think that's very interesting as you read through the Quran. But they don't believe him to be the divine Son of God. With these other things, I don't know exactly what he's talking about with the Ethiopian Bible and stuff of that nature. Let's talk about what he says at the very beginning. Just as a school of thought, if someone had a vision of future events, could they not draw upon words, phrases, or occurrences from said future events? Okay. Well, in a sense, yes, but see, that's the thing is you're trying. We've got to see whether or not Joseph Smith was a true prophet or not. And in my book, Questions About Mormon Doctrine, one of the false prophecies that he gave was in regards to the Civil War, and also in regards to what did I talk about? Yeah, I think I talked about the Civil War. But I know I did talk about the temple in Independence, Missouri, which never was done, and even later LDS writers refer to this, that this prophecy was never fulfilled. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So I don't know exactly all that he's talking about here, and I'd be glad for him to expand more on what he's saying there. Now, here's what I want to say in regards to the Book of Mormon, and that it does heavily rely upon the King James Version. And I thought Brother Dave Miller did a great job in his book talking about about the Mormon Church. You can find it for free on the Apologia Express website. But he says, in the first place, much of the King James Version of the Bible has been reproduced verbatim in the Book of Mormon, estimated to be from 17,000 to 27,000 words. For example, Mosiah 14 is a reproduction of Isaiah 53. And another thing I want to say about that again, about Mosiah 14, notice, my friends, that technically speaking, remember there wasn't original chapters and verses in the Bible. Those were added on later. And I think it's interesting, in Mosiah 14, it begins with Isaiah 53:1, even though that prophecy really begins earlier than that, because it talks about, behold, my servant shall do this. And so that to me is an indication that this was man-made. But anyways. Third, Nephi 13:1 through 23 is simply Matthew 6:1 through 23. Moroni 7:45 is copied from 1 Corinthians 13:4 through 7. Moroni 7:48 is 1 John 3:2. Moroni 10:8 through 17 is taken from 1 Corinthians 12:4 through 11. Alma 5:52 is Matthew 3:10. Second Nephi 14:1 through 3 is Isaiah 4:1 through 3. The author of the Book of Mormon obviously had before him a copy of the King James Bible and simply copied many sections directly from it, though it is claimed that the Book of Mormon was actually written from 600 to 421 years before Christ. But this is only half of the problem on this point. The King James Version is an uninspired translation of available Hebrew and Greek manuscripts into the English language of the late 16th and early 17th century, completed in 1611. But God gave the Old Testament to the Israelites in their native language, Hebrew, and he gave the New Testament in the first century in the common language of that day, Koine Greek. Question: why in the world would God give his word to Joseph Smith in 19th century America, 1830, not in American English, but in the British language of 17th century England? The obvious answer to the question is that God would not do so. The absurdity is inconsistent with the nature of God. The reproduction of so much of the King James Version in the Book of Mormon raises four additional concerns. First, Mormons frequently attempt to establish the superiority of the Book of Mormon over the Bible by insisting that the Bible has been corrupted through the centuries in the process of translation, a contention similar to Islam's defense of the Quran. But if the Bible has been so adversely affected, why does the Book of Mormon quote so much of the King James Version? To be consistent, those who hold this viewpoint must admit that at least those portions of the Bible are to be considered accurate. Second, all textual critics, those who study the original manuscript evidence that attests to the text of the New Testament, know that textual variance exists in the extant manuscript evidence. The vast majority of these discordant readings are resolved when all the textual evidence is considered. If the Book of Mormon were inspired, not only would it refrain from incorporating the King James Version within its pages, it would also not include in those sections the manuscript errors that have crept into the text. Here was the perfect opportunity in 1830 for God to clarify the variants that had accumulated during the previous 200 years, as well as the 1500 years prior to the King James Version. Instead, the Book of Mormon perpetuates the mistakes. For example, several textual variants occur in Matthew 6, a chapter that was reproduced in 3 Nephi 13. In Matthew 6:4, the Textus Receptus, the Greek text upon which the King James was based, contains the words himself and openly. These insertions were perpetuated by the author of the Book of Mormon in 3 Nephi 13, verse 4, as well as was the word openly in verses 8 and 16 of Matthew 6 and 3 Nephi 13, 6, 18. Likewise, the Trinitarian description in 3 Nephi 13:13 and Matthew 6:13 in the King James Version, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever, amen," is not supported by the earliest and most reliable manuscript witnesses to the text of the New Testament. Subsequent translations, including the American Standard Version, omit the sentence altogether, or in the case of the New American Standard Bible, places it in brackets. The manuscript evidence simply does not support these additions as being in the original inspired autograph authored by Matthew. Many, what I'm trying to, but there's some things even unpacked there. But what we're trying to say is that the Book of Mormon does incorporate into it what the King James Version had, which shows you that the Book of Mormon's not ancient; it's actually modern fraud. In fact, I think one of the best examples here is taken, you remember that in the book of Acts, Peter was giving a sermon there, and he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 18. What's really, really interesting to me is when you go to 3 Nephi 20, this is a text where Jesus is visiting the Nephites. He came down to earth after he had ascended into heaven, as we see in Acts 1. Well, he actually came down to earth again and visited the Americas. And there, notice that it says, "Behold, I am he of whom Moses spake, saying, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren like unto me. Him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever he shall say unto you. And it shall come to pass that every soul who will not hear that prophet shall be cut off from among the people." Verily I say unto you, yea, and all the prophets from Samuel and those that follow after, as many as have spoken, have testified of me. Notice how Jesus is following in the footsteps of Peter's sermon, right, in Acts 3. And behold, ye are the children of the prophets, and ye are of the house of Israel, and ye are of the covenant which the Father made with your fathers, saying unto Abraham, and in thy seed shall all the kindreds of the earth be blessed. And there's some differences there, right? There's some added words to that. The Father having raised me up unto you first, and sent me to bless you in turning away from every one of you from his iniquities, and this because ye are the children of the covenant. So you can see there how those who were copying the King James Version, but also incorporating some of even Peter's inspired message there in 3rd Nephi, verse 20. So that's something that needs to be thought about in regards to that. All right, another comment that was made. Dan Vogel has taught me more about Joseph Smith and where the Book of Mormon came from, more than any other historian. Why? Because it's the most plausible and requires the least conjecture. Now, I don't know exactly what Dan Vogel believes, so I can't comment on that. I do know he's a historian, and he has written some books, and I have one on my bookshelf that I need to read. But anyways, so what I wanted to ask Outlawed Media is this: could you please in the comments or make a video why it's the most plausible theory? Because I've taken the time to give what I believe, how the information adds all up, the evidence is consistent with what I've spoken about in the 35 videos that were made. So the evidence would have to account for why the Book of Mormon contradicts the Bible, because it does. And we saw in the video 4 verses that contradict the book of that show the Book of Mormon to be false. It has to account for why some newspapers made the connection independently to Rigdon in 1831. I think that's a very interesting piece of information. It has to account for why the Conuet witnesses made the connection independently to Spalding in 1832 because of Hyde's visit. We see that, you remember that as we think about all of this, and I kind of did this as an overview, if you will remember. So I don't really want to go through all this information again, but basically you'll remember that this was a highly held belief in early 18th to 19th century belief that the Indians' ancestors, or the American Indians, were the Israelites. I mean, we see this from James Adair, we see this from William Penn, we see this from Elias Boudinot, if that's how you say his name, and some others. And what's interesting is in Conuet, Ohio, where Solomon Spalding lived for a time, and from 1809 to 1812, but even a little bit before that, you could say. I mean, I know, and we do know 1809 to 1812. We do know that, but you can check my sources in the other videos. But Orson Hyde and William Smith had come to visit him. Or Samuel Smith. I can't remember. I know he's related to Joseph Smith somehow. So forgive me, I can't remember exactly. But there were those who heard Orson Hyde speak, and they made the connection to Solomon Spalding, to his writings. And so, interesting enough, that was 1832, but in February 15th of 1831, there was the connection that was made to Rigdon, Sidney Rigdon. I think that's really interesting. And then you have Bennett, just a few months later, he also was able to gain research and information and was able to say that it was Rigdon who was the author of the Book of Mormon. So that's interesting. And then you have Holbert, mid-April of 1833, who was a Latter-day Saint, who also started hearing about this connection to Solomon Spaulding, and that was somehow made through the Jackson, which was written by Benjamin Winchester. And so somehow it's highly possible that Jackson pointed to John and Martha Spaulding, and so he visited them, and then John and Martha Spaulding told Holbert to go visit Conneaut to get eyewitness testimony, which was Aaron Wright, Nahum Howard, Oliver Smith in August of 1833. And what's interesting is Holbert would go to Mentor, Ohio, and there would be a committee formed. Later on, we see that he went to visit Artemus Cunningham. He went to visit in September of 1833. Somehow he would have also had gotten in contact with Henry Lake and John Miller. Somewhere in September of 1833, somewhere around there. And then what's interesting is, so this committee sponsored Holbert, and he was able to go to Matilda Davidson, ultimately, who was the widow of Solomon Spaulding, and he was able to find the manuscript story, Conneaut Creek. And then before he left New York, he actually gave some information to the editor there, Pomeroy Tucker, and evidently it was, of course, Davidson, Matilda, who had told Holbert that it was Rigdon who was behind the authorship of the Book of Mormon, believed to be notorious Rigdon. So you see the connection that Holbert gives to Tucker, and in which, of course, that connects to Sidney Rigdon. And then there's a case that Holbert must have got that from Matilda Davidson. And so now you can see how Holbert would have now been able to make, this is where you see the connections that were independent from one another start to form together. And I think that's kind of interesting, that it's here where they would have this theory would have, so to speak, blossomed. Even though it was, a year earlier that it was the Conneaut witnesses who had heard Hyde speak from Solomon Spaulding's writings in the Book of Mormon. And then you have, of course, Bennett and those others, right? So it has to account why the Conneaut witnesses made the connection between independently and Spaulding in 1832. It has to account for when Holbert went to visit the Conneaut witnesses the second time in the winter of 1833. And he showed them the first manuscript, that manuscript story, and they said it was Spaulding's manuscript. But the Conneaut witnesses says, yes, this is the handwriting of Spaulding, but it's not the one that we reported to you, Holbert. This is not the same manuscript. So I found that very interesting. So a part of that committee that was formed in Mentor, Ohio, was a man named James Briggs. And I think James Briggs wrote some really interesting articles when you read all of them. And one of the things that James Briggs talks about is how he said, and this is very interesting, he said that he was able to look at manuscript found, not manuscript story, manuscript found, and compare it to the Book of Mormon, and he says that the styles were very similar and so forth. I think it's very interesting because later on, in many, many years that take place after that, he would say that he was, the manuscript story was, if I remember right, discovered in 1884. And so he was sent, he somehow got I don't know if he got a copy of manuscript story, I'm not, but I know he was able to look at manuscript story, and he was able to say, yes, I was able to look at manuscript story, and he says, I remember this is not the same one that I investigated when I was there in the 1830s. So I find that very interesting that he even clarifies that there's two different manuscripts. So what happened to manuscript found? Well, that's the mystery, right? And we know that Hulbert even went to Aaron Wright, and he probably went to some others, but we're not certain. We can't, prove that with 100% certainty. But we do know that Wright had written a draft letter that was discovered, and and even Wright says, I'm looking at this manuscript that Hulbert is showing me, which is a manuscript story, and it's not the same one that I talked about in my former statement. And then what's interesting to me is, he looked at manuscript story, and he's the one that actually Aaron Wright made the connection to Orson Hyde. And then Hulbert was able to take all the affidavits, and he gave them to E.D. Howe, and E.D. Howe, which were all those in the green. He delivered those statements to E.D. Howe, and E.D. Howe put them in his book. Now, even E.D. Howe even visited some of these people. He wanted to make sure that they were reliable. I found that very interesting in a statement that he made. We also see that I'm trying to think. E.D. Howe was given manuscript story, is what's interesting. Now, he put all those affidavits toward the end of his book and published his book, Manuscript Mormonism Unveiled, in November of 1834. Now, next, what we see is what happened to manuscript found. Well, we don't know exactly. Sadly, it was claimed that Hulbert had sold it to the Mormons for some money, but not exactly certain on the outcome of what happened. Anyways, even you can see years later when manuscript story was discovered in Hawaii, that there was a note attached where Oliver Smith, John Miller, and Aaron Wright had said this is the manuscript of Solomon Spaulding here. So now another interesting thing about this is even there on the left-hand side, Jesse Moss, he actually talked about how he also had talked to Aaron Wright, evidently, because he says it was a judge, and Aaron Wright was a judge. And James Barr Walker, he probably talked to John Miller. It seems to be the case. And then you have all these people who give these affidavits that are written down, and they testify that these men were reliable and they're good men who gave these testimonies, like Aaron Wright, Nahum Howard, and Oliver Smith, and others. And then what's interesting is, even later on, you have other witnesses who come along and say, yes, Solomon Spaulding's manuscript was stolen by Sidney Rigdon. They believed him to be the thief, which was Matilda Davidson, Joseph Miller, and Reddick McKee. And then Josiah Spaulding, he gave his testimony, but he said that, if I remember correctly, that Matilda Davidson was the one who told him about Sidney Rigdon. He didn't say his name. He just said it was a very leading Mormon. And then there's Robert Patterson, Sr., who, if I remember right, had said a man had come from the east to, publish a manuscript. Then you have those here who say that Sidney Rigdon was involved in manuscript found. So they said that he had taken manuscript found. And then you have as a case, let's see, yeah. So Adamson Bentley and all of them said that how Sidney Rigdon had talked about how there was a book coming out, even in the earliest newspaper account that we have is the summer of 1829, but some of those witnesses, it was before the summer of 1829. And then you have to account for some of these people who claimed that there was a connection between Rigdon and Joseph Smith before the Book of Mormon actually came out. And then what's really interesting to me is here you have Solomon Spaulding, right, who has this war experience, law education, classics education, curiosity about the first inhabitants, has biblical knowledge if he was a minister. He wrote in the old style, as those who, that's why they named him Old Come to Pass. And then he had the ability to write. And so we know he wrote manuscript story, no doubt about that, in which, interesting enough, it's a different title than what the eyewitnesses said, right? And they said the plot is about the Romans coming during Constantine's time. It was never finished, missing pages, has an abrupt ending, and it stopped near the beginning of 1812. And that makes sense if he starts to begin again, in which that's what the witnesses said he did. He went back further in time, and he wanted to do a better job, in which there's a different title. There's the, so to speak, the Lost Tribes of Israel. It's fit for publication. It needed security money. But what's really interesting is how all these witnesses get right the details, which do correspond to the Book of Mormon, which I find very interesting. And then the one that really sticks out is the no religious matter, which is why if Rigdon had stolen the manuscript, then he would have transformed it into the Book of Mormon. So, in which Rigdon, we think about him, he loved to read. He believed he was called of God, devoted to the study of the Bible. He was receptive. He was an orator, a Bible scholar. He had different mood swings. He thought of himself as a prophet, and he could easily make up something akin to Scripture. He did that with regards to the letters he wrote to Stephen Post. And then you have Spaulding's fingerprints because it is the right cultural context. Because people believe that to be something that they believe to be true, that the Israelites were the ancestors of the American Indians. Then you have the parallel themes, word parallels, character names, and that, yes, there are different character names, but interesting how, there's those what we call the roots. There's shared unique word patterns. There's indecision, and it came to pass is written in the Book of Mormon and in what was claimed to be manuscript found, but and it came to pass is not found in manuscript story. And then there's the frequently used words and the unique words used by Spaulding, which you can see in those other videos. And then you have restoration principle, where Rigdon took things to an extreme, saying such things like miracles have to be restored, even though that was something that was actually temporary. And then what's interesting to me is, let's just go down here the Book of Mormon does endorse Rigdon's theological views, like communal living, for example, that miracles would be in the modern times. The Book of Mormon contains lots of biblical passages, contains adopted views of the American Restoration Movement, such as, for example, we know the Bible teaches that baptism is for the remission of sins. That's Acts 2:38, many other verses. But we see that also something that Sidney Rigdon had learned, and he incorporated into the Book of Mormon. And then you have the Children of Men, which contains former theological views and new views. And sadly, that would lead to contradictions, because of what he once formerly believed, and now he puts his new beliefs in there, and he doesn't take out the old beliefs. So all this, when you think about it, does form to be the Book of Mormon when you take it into consideration. So it has to account as to why some witnesses would have testified that Sidney Rigdon was the theft of manuscript found. I mean, what would be the ulterior motive why these witnesses would lie about this? And then it has to account as to why some witnesses would have testified that Sidney Rigdon had manuscript found. What would be the ulterior motive there? It has to account for the eyewitnesses who claim that Rigdon was talking about a new religion in Revelation before the summer of 1829, when the first newspaper account mentioned the Book of Mormon. It has to account, another theory would have to account for the eyewitnesses who claim they saw Rigdon and Smith together before his conversion in November of 1830. It has to account for the eyewitnesses who were able to give the detail that there was no religious material manuscript found, which an undesigned coincidence that fits perfectly well that Rigdon Company transformed it into the Book of Mormon. So I hope that helps you to see how we're responding to these things. We're going to do another critique in just a moment, so stick around if you like, and thank you so much. Have a good day.